Hello friends, welcome back to Tutorials in English Literature. In today's lesson, I shall discuss the Graveyard School of Poetry. The first thing I shall talk over is what is Graveyard School of Poetry. So, Graveyard School of Poets is a group of 18th century English poets who wrote poems about death, mortality and gloom, and these poems were often actually set in graveyards. In contrast with their rational neoclassical contemporaries, Graveyard School of Poets emphasized subjectivity, mystery and melancholy in their poems. In my lecture on the neoclassicism in 18th century England, I have pointed out the salient features of neoclassical poetry. That was the rationalism, emphasis on correctness, emphasis on the rules of the ancient writers. And their poetry is very different from these neoclassical poets. These poets are sometimes also called Churchyard School of Poets. The term Graveyard School is an indefinite literary grouping that binds together a wide variety of authors. What makes a poem graveyard poem remains open to critical dispute. That means the critics are not agreed on a single point. There is variety of views. The term itself was not used as a brand for the poets and their poetry until William McNeill Dixon did so in 1898. So he popularized the term. The following characteristics are common in this school of poetry and it will help us to understand the Graveyard School of Poetry. The first important feature is that these poems are often set in graveyard. The second common characteristic is that the writings of the graveyard poets frequently touched on the themes of death, mortality, religion, melancholy and vanity of human pretensions. The third salient feature is that these poets think about the uncertainty of life that touched them most. They also thought about the solitude of death and the grave and the anguish of bereavement. The next feature is these poems are often elegiac in tone and their poems make frequent use of funeral or gloomy imagery, though they never tried to create sensations like the Gothic novelists. Another important trait of this group of poets is that these poets were often very Christian writers. They used the imagery of night, death and gloom in spiritual contemplations of human mortality and our relation to the divine. These poems are often didactic and aim at religious and moral instruction, and this is where they are different from Gothic novels. The last important characteristic is that graveyard poetry expressed an interest in ancient English poetic forms and folk poetry. Now, we should also know why this particular type of poetry thrived in 18th century England, which we know as the age of prose and reason. Some literary critics have emphasized Milton's minor poetry as the main influence of the meditative verse written by the graveyard poets. For example, a famous critic, W.L. Phillips, for example, said that it was Milton's Il Penseroso, which is a meditative and melancholic poem, penetrated most deeply into the romantic soul. Apart from this particular literary influence, the socio-cultural condition of 18th century England was also helpful for the growth and development of this particular kind of poetry. So the second probable reason is the revival of religion in the early 18th century England. As a result of the religious revival, it was a time of both spiritual unrest and regeneration. Therefore, meditation and melancholy, death and life, ghosts and graveyards were attractive subjects to poets at that time. The third reason is that religious culture of the mid-18th century included an emphasis on private devotion as well as the end of printed funeral sermons, which was very popular. Each of these conditions demanded a new kind of text with which people could meditate on life and death in a personal setting. The graveyard school met that need, and the poems were thus quite popular, especially with the middle class. Now let's talk about some of its notable examples. At its narrowest, the term graveyard school refers to 4 poems. The first one is Thomas Gray's Elegy written in a country churchyard. The second one is Thomas Parnell's Night Piece on Death. The third one is Robert Blair's The Grave. And the last one is Edward Young's Night Thoughts. At its broadest, when we consider the term in its broadest sense, it can describe a host of poetry and prose works popular in the early and mid-18th century. The last point of my discussion is the influence of the Graveyard School of Poets on writers of latter generations. Firstly, this school was instrumental in the development of the Gothic novel, contributing to the dark, mysterious mood and storylines that characterize the genre of Gothic. Secondly, they are also considered pre-romantics, precursor of romantics, ushering in the romantic literary movement by their reflection on emotional states. This emotional reflection is seen in Coleridge's Dejection and Ode and Keats' Ode on Melancholy. The early works of Southey, Byron, Shelley also show the influence of the Graveyard School of Poetry. Their air of pensive gloom presaged the melancholy of the Romantic movement. I am concluding my discussion here. If you like this lesson, please hit the like button. If you still have any doubt or query, you can ask me in the comment section. I shall request you to subscribe to my channel, where you will get a regular update of this kind of quality content. That's all for today. Thank you for watching.